There's a truth anyone stepping into a medieval winter feels instantly. The cold at 28 degrees Yarv wasn't a storm that struck in an instant, but a patient predator, quietly pulling the warmth out of a house as if testing how long a family could endure. The long night pressed a thick silence onto the earthen roof, so heavy you could hear the timber shrinking from the cold. The last breaths of fire from the hearth glowed weakly, red like the fading eyes of a creature about to vanish. And it was in that seemingly quiet moment that 8 survival techniques, sharpened through hundreds of winters, revealed themselves, each one a precise link in the chain that kept life from slipping out through the walls of earth. Here lies the hook. If even one link was forgotten, one wall mixed wrong, one smoke layer vented too fast, one sleeping cluster drifting apart, or one stone pot failing to hold its final breath of heat, sometimes a single night was enough to drain an entire family. It reminds us that the medieval world wasn't an age of crudeness, but an age of absolute observation. They turned ordinary materials into a defensive system, far more sophisticated than we tend to imagine. And as you watch the next techniques unfold, ask yourself, if you were thrown into a 28 degrees night like this, would you stay calm enough to notice what truly keeps you alive? If any thought comes to you as you follow along, share it, so I can keep uncovering the forgotten survival secrets time tried to erase. In the medieval world, where 28-degree fires wasn't just a number, but the line between a steady night and one spent shivering to exhaustion, the earthen wall around them wasn't a crude material. It was the heat-holding engine their entire family depended on. They had no fine stone, no valuable timber, but they had the wisdom passed down through generations, mixing damp soil with finely cut straw to form a fiber framework, then adding warm organic matter from the stall to increase binding strength and slow heat loss. That mixture was stomped, packed, and spread onto a wooden frame until it became a thick, heavy, dense layer of armor that cold winds couldn't find a way through. During the day, the wall absorbed every faint scrap of warmth from the sun and from the hearth. At night, it released that warmth back in slow pulses, like the quiet breathing of the house itself. The climax lies here. Even the smallest mistake in the mix, too wet, too dry, too little straw, or a layer spread too thin, was enough for heat to leak out all night, forcing the entire family to stay awake until dawn from the cold. To medieval people, every strike of the mallet into that wall wasn't a construction step. It was a life or death decision. A wager that tonight the warmth would remain on their side. On a 28-degree Fahrenheit medieval night, the greatest enemy wasn't a blizzard, but something far more silent. The cold wind slipping through gaps so tiny the naked eye could barely spot them. Medieval people knew a house could hold warmth with earthen walls and straw floors, but a single door placed in the wrong direction could undo all of that work, like breath fading in freezing air. That's why their doors were always lower than normal, angled away from the north wind, and shielded by an extra partition like a wooden shield. Stepping through the entrance wasn't convenient, but convenience never mattered when winter was standing at the threshold. The twist appears here. When wind slipped through a door gap, it didn't just bring in cold. It carried the power to drain all the warmth stored throughout the day. Even a crack the width of a finger was enough for the cold to crawl into the house like an invisible creature, slithering across the earthen floor and pushing back every layer of heat. Medieval people used to say they could predict the fortune of a night simply by the sound of wind at the door. If the hiss was too sharp, the whole family knew they would stay awake until morning, pressing their backs together for warmth. And if the door was misaligned by even a few degrees, they practically accepted defeat before winter had even begun. Looking back at this technique, we realize medieval survival didn't rely on grand structures, but on their ability to read the temperament of the wind. If you've ever spent a cold night and noticed how a single draft can make you shiver uncontrollably, share that experience in the comments. Your story might help others understand why our ancestors treated every doorway with such care. Medieval people realized early on a truth many still underestimate today. The most dangerous cold didn't fall from the sky. It rose from the ground. The frozen earth beneath their feet didn't just sting. It pulled heat from the body as if an invisible hand were quietly drawing warmth out of them. That's why creating a heat-preserving floor wasn't a luxury. It was a survival instinct. They began by packing the soil tightly to eliminate air pockets, then spreading a fine layer of organic material to slow heat transfer. Next came a thin sheet of ash from the hearth, something that looked like waste, but was actually a superb insulator and moisture barrier. Finally, they laid dry straw in a soft, crude carpet that prevented heat from escaping and shielded their feet from the deep, piercing cold of frozen earth. The climax of this technique lies in how fragile it was. If the straw became even slightly damp, the cold would shoot upward like a needle, making the whole family shiver, even while the hearth was still burning. On a 28-degree night, the difference between a dry floor and a damp one could easily be the difference between a full night's sleep and staying awake until dawn because their feet had gone numb. Looking back at how they built their floors, we understand something else. They weren't just building a house, they were building a protective layer for the heartbeat of the family. And if you've ever felt your feet go numb, even with a heater beside you, you'll understand why medieval people treated a warm floor as a survival secret. In the 28-degree cold, medieval people understood clearly that the real enemy wasn't the wind above their heads. It was the ground beneath their feet. Frozen earth could pull heat from the body so quickly, it felt as if a cold hand were slowly drawing the warmth out of the soles of their feet, making their whole body tremble even under thick layers of clothing. So they had to create a floor that could stop that silent attack. To do it, they mixed damp soil, hearth ash, and dry straw with their bare hands or feet already numb from the cold. The soil had to be pliable enough to pack tight, the ash completely dry to hold heat and absorb moisture, and the straw finely cut to form a natural insulating mat. When the mixture was stomped evenly and pressed down into a foundation, the floor became thick, solid, and stable enough that the cold could no longer find a path upward. The terrifying twist lies here. If the straw absorbed moisture from the previous night, the floor would turn cold in a way medieval people called cold creeping, the chill rising from the earth, slow but relentless, keeping the entire family awake even when they huddled tightly around the hearth. A dry floor could save a household. A damp floor could force them to stay up all night just to hold on to whatever warmth remained. Looking at that floor, we see they weren't just fighting the cold. They were defeating the very ground beneath their feet. On a medieval night at 28 degrees, when wind slipped through the roof and the fire in the hearth had faded to a soft, breathing layer of embers. People understood they were never truly alone in the fight against the cold. Families back then believed in something that sounded like legend, but had been proven by hundreds of winters. The strongest warmth didn't come from fire. It came from the human body itself. And to protect that inner flame, they created a technique modern people often overlook: the heat-keeping sleep cluster. No one slept alone. Children stayed in the center, adults on the outside, and small livestock or the household dog curled near their feet to share heat. When they pressed close together, their breaths formed a thin mist. Their body heat caught on wool clothing, on smoke-scented blankets, even on the still air trapped inside the dark room. That formation created a ring of heat, a safe zone the cold struggled to break through. And medieval people believed that if the ring broke apart, the warmth would scatter like ashes in the wind. The twist that made this technique almost mystical is this: drift just a few handspans away from the cluster, and your body could lose up to 40% of its heat in a few hours. Many old folk accounts describe people waking up freezing simply because they shifted away from the heat ring. It sounds mythical, but in a real 28-degree-off night, it was the mathematics of survival. If you've ever spent a cold night curling into one corner of a blanket just to stay warm, you'll understand why medieval people treated the sleep cluster like a protective charm. And if you've had a similar experience, share it in the comments. Sometimes your story might be the missing piece that helps unlock another survival secret buried under centuries of dust. For medieval people, 28-degree alpha wasn't a cold you could fight with a thick coat. It was a challenge that forced them to turn their own bodies into a finely tuned heat-keeping system. They understood clearly that clothing wasn't just for covering. It was for managing warmth, holding in what needed to stay, releasing what needed to escape. And if they made a mistake with even one layer, moisture would get trapped and the cold would double its strength. The innermost layer was always linen, a light, quick-drying fabric that kept sweat from clinging to the skin. On top of it came thick woven wool, its twisted fibers creating thousands of tiny air pockets that held warmth without suffocating the body. The outermost layer was a cloak or wind-blocking garment, usually made from coarse wool or stiffened hide, designed to stop the piercing, needle-sharp evening winds. Each layer had a purpose, like the protective tiers of an ancient calculating machine. The climax lies here. Skip the linen layer, and moisture from the body would get trapped in the wool, making the cold far more deadly. Skip the outer layer, and the wind would tear apart all the heat-keeping work happening inside. Medieval people weren't wealthy, but they were rich in something we rarely notice: knowledge of how the human body interacts with weather. Looking back at that system, we realize they weren't wearing clothes, they were wearing strategy. And in a medieval winter, that strategy was often the reason they made it through one more night. When a medieval night fell and the temperature slipped to 28 degrees, the fire in the hearth was no longer just a flame. It was a fragile prayer. Medieval people understood they couldn't keep a fire burning all night. Wood was scarce, human strength limited. So they created a strategy that sounded simple, but became the household's lifeline: the earthen oven and the ember bed. The earthen oven, with walls thick as a turtle shell, absorbed every bit of heat before the fire died, then released that warmth for hours, like a slow, hidden heartbeat in the center of the home. Beside it, the ember bed was made by burying glowing coals inside a layer of dry ash, trapping the last of the heat as if protecting a spark that wasn't allowed to die. When the house fell into darkness, that faint red glow was the only proof that life still lingered inside. The climax lies here. If the embers died too early, the entire family had to wake in the freezing dark to restart the fire, because just a few hours without a heat source would let the cold creep up from the floor and choke out the warmth they had saved since the afternoon. On a medieval night, a single coal still glowing was worth more than an armful of fresh firewood. In the 28-degree off cold, a medieval meal wasn't a moment to enjoy. It was a ritual to protect whatever warmth the family still had left. Because cold water made heat disappear too fast, medieval people came up with a cooking method that sounded poor, but was so clever. Modern researchers have had to rethink it. Cooking without water. They heated river stones until the surface cracked slightly, then placed them into clay pots filled with grains, root vegetables, or minced meat. The heat from the stones spread slowly, without escaping into the air, creating a steady, lasting warmth that kept food hot longer than a small fire ever could. In the dark room, the rising steam from the clay pot looked like a thin ribbon of mist, completely opposite to the cold, drafts sneaking through the wall cracks. This was their show-off moment of medieval intelligence. They weren't just cooking, they were controlling heat like an ancient form of science. No one called it physics, but everyone understood that if the pot lost heat too fast, the family would shiver through the night because they had no other source of warmth to rely on. The twist lies in how fragile the method was. If the stone overheated and cracked the pot, or if they added just a bit too much ash and diverted the heat the wrong way, all the warmth would vanish in minutes, and the whole family would curl up as if winter had just won a silent battle. In the medieval world, they didn't eat to be full. They ate to stay alive. And once you understand that, every wisp of heat rising from the pot becomes a small victory over the winter knocking at their door. The subtle hook appears right after we've gone through all 8 techniques. There's something medieval people never said out loud, yet everyone understood. Winter wasn't an enemy they defeated once and for all, but an exam that returned every year, always waiting for them to slip on even the smallest detail. And it was that fragility that turned each technique we just saw into sharp fragments of a shield, pieced together into armor against the cold. Looking back, we see they didn't rely on strength nor on miracles. They relied on their ability to notice things that seemed meaningless. The direction of the wind, the moisture in the floor, the way ash held heat, the way breath settled as a thin layer of dew on wool. They survived not because they were tougher than us, but because they learned to read the world through eyes that recognized every small signal winter sent. And on many 28-degree F nights, that attention to detail was what kept them alive. The lesson is clear. People didn't survive winter through possessions, but through intelligence and adaptability. What saved them wasn't firewood or flame, but the understanding that any tiny detail could mark the line between a peaceful night and an exhausting one. If you were placed in a medieval night with only the techniques you've just seen, how long do you think you would last? Share your thoughts below. Your perspective helps me understand what viewers are truly curious about, so I can keep uncovering more survival journeys hidden by time. And if you enjoy this kind of secret history perspective, follow the channel so you won't miss the next stories. Stories that might change how you see the past and how you walk through your own winter.